Well, good morning and welcome to day 15 of our devotional series in Philippians. We're in chapter 2 as we pick it up today. Last time the Apostle Paul told us something very important. He said, "It is God who is at work in you, both to desire and to work for his good pleasure." So God is working inside of us, that statement tells us. Today, Paul describes, or begins to anyways, describe what that work should begin looking like outside of us. And interestingly, he doesn't begin with something dramatic. He actually begins with our attitude. And here's the key thought for today. One of the clearest ways Christians shine in a dark world is through a noticeably different spirit. Point number 1, look at verse 14 now. This is chapter 2 of Philippians, verse 14. Do all things without complaining. And we'll stop right there. Some translations use the word grumbling. For instance, the one I have in front of me. Do all things without grumbling. Whatever word you use, those are both good words. It's quite a command, isn't it? It doesn't say, try to complain a little less. Paul says, do all things without complaining. And that stings when he says that, doesn't it? That's ouch. That hurts a little bit because complaining can become so normal that we barely recognize it anymore. Let's be honest. We complain about the weather. We complain about the traffic. We complain about prices. We complain about our jobs. We complain about our families. We complain about our neighbors. We complain about politics. We complain about the government. We complain about the church. We complain about other people. Sometimes complaining almost becomes a conversational habit. I really think there are sometimes people would if they couldn't complain somehow, what would there be left for to talk about, right? But you know how it works. Someone complains. We add our complaint. Then they add another complaint. And before long, we've spent 15 minutes making each other miserable. But Paul says Christians should be different. Why? Well, because complaining reveals something about the heart. At its deepest level, complaining communicates, God, I don't like what you've allowed into my life. Now, we need an important distinction here. Are we allowed to be sad? Are we allowed to lament and express anguish? Well, the Bible absolutely does allow that. Some of the most beautiful Psalms include where David pours out his pain to God. Jesus himself wept. There's nothing unspiritual about acknowledging that something hurts. Lament brings our pain to God. Complaining, on the other hand, often nurses our dissatisfaction without trusting God. And that's a big difference. God doesn't ask us to pretend everything is good. He asks us to trust that He is good, even when everything is not. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 tells us to give thanks in everything. Point number 2, if we continue that verse, we've already read, do all things without grumbling. Now this phrase, or disputing, or another translation might use the word arguments, without arguments. Now, this goes beyond simply having a disagreement. Christians can disagree. Paul himself had a disagreement. A couple Sundays ago, we were talking about it with a man named Barnabas, and with others also. We know Peter and Paul had a disagreement. The problem is, though, that a contentious spirit always wants another argument. And some people seem incapable of allowing anything to pass without correcting it, without challenging it, and without debating it. And or without having the final word. They have to have the final word on it. And if we're not careful, that attitude can come into the church. And we can become, if we're not careful, more interested in winning an argument than loving a person. 2 Timothy 2:24 says, "The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to all." I fear that we've lost the ability in our culture to agree graciously. And unfortunately, even in the church, we're losing that ability. We have to rediscover that subtle art of disagreeing when we do disagree, but doing it graciously. Point number 3, why does Paul care so much about this? Verse 15 says, "So that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach." Now, if you ask a lot of people, how do you live a life above reproach? How do you maintain blamelessness and innocence? Well, a lot of people would say, well, you avoid certain sinful behaviors. But this is where this passage becomes especially interesting. Paul is saying we are above reproach and we are blameless and innocent if we can live life without complaining or disputing. Paul doesn't merely say don't complain because complaining is annoying. Of course, complaining is annoying, for sure. But Paul doesn't say don't complain because complaining is annoying. He connects our attitude to our witness, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach. In other words, people are watching, not because we have to perform for them, but because our lives say something about the God we claim to follow. If Christians are every bit as bitter and every bit as angry and every bit as argumentative and every bit as cynical and every bit as abrasive as everyone around us, well, people may reasonably wonder, what difference does Jesus actually make? But imagine someone who goes through genuine difficulty and somehow retains kindness. Someone who gets mistreated and refuses to become bitter. Someone who disagrees without becoming hateful. Someone who experiences disappointment but continues trusting God. Well, people notice that. And our response to difficulty is actually a more powerful testimony than any words we will ever say about our faith. Point number 4, notice this phrase. We're continuing on here. In the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world. That's a beautiful picture. Jesus used similar language when he told his followers, "You are the light of the world." And here's something about light. You notice it most when it's dark. A candle at noon isn't all that impressive. But that same candle, if you light it in a completely dark room, well, now suddenly everybody notices. Maybe that's part of why God has placed us where he has. We sometimes look at the culture around us and we become discouraged. And there's so much anger and so much division and cynicism and fear. But maybe instead of merely complaining about the darkness, God is asking us to shine in it. Christians aren't called to merely criticize darkness. We're called to bring light into it. And sometimes that might look surprisingly ordinary. Kindness and patience and gratitude and gentleness. Forgiveness, hope, and joy. And then it says, if we keep going here, verse 16 again, holding fast the word of life so that, that's the phrase I wanted to focus on. Holding fast the word of life. Holding fast the word of life. So we don't manufacture Christian hope through positive thinking. We hold on to God's truth. When circumstances say give up, we hold on to the word of life. When fear says God has forgotten you, we hold on to the word of life. When culture says just live for yourselves, live for yourself, we hold on to the word of life. And I love that phrase, the word of life, because the gospel doesn't merely tell us how to behave. It gives us a life. Jesus changes us from the inside, and then that new life begins shining outward. So here's a thought. Imagine going through one entire day without complaining, intentionally refusing to complain. We can acknowledge problems, you can solve problems, can even express disappointment, but you refuse to feed a complaining spirit. Every time a complaint begins forming, you pause and instead you ask, is there something I can thank God for here? Imagine what that might do to our hearts if we do that, even for one day. Imagine what it might do to our homes, and imagine what it might do to our workplaces, and what it would do in our church, because gratitude is contagious. Do all things without complaining. Apparently, a grateful, peaceful, gracious, hopeful Christian is more unusual than we sometimes realize. In a cynical world, gratitude shines. And in an angry word, gentleness shines. Or in a divided world, grace shines. Jesus shines through us. See you next time.